These words this morning come from Boris Novak. This is Decisions. Between two words, choose the quieter one. Between word and silence, choose listening. Between two books, choose the dustier one. Between earth and sky, choose a bird. Between two animals, choose the one who needs you more. Between two children, choose both. Between the lesser and the bigger evil, choose neither. Between hope and despair, choose hope. It will be harder to bear. The morning of November 9th, 2016, I remember clearly walking into work 5 weeks into my chaplaincy residency. I went to bed early enough the night before to still have had some hope, but woke up to a world where I could no longer deny the fact that we were indeed who I was afraid we were. The air in the office that morning was so thick it was like swimming trying to move through it. We were about a dozen staff across the political spectrum, and people could barely talk. The other white women were crying quietly off and on. We gathered for our morning staff meeting, and it was really hard. We were chaplains, social workers, therapists, peer support specialists, people skilled in communicating and being with other people. But that morning, it was a dense slog. We were all grieving. Different state, different context, same deflatedness 8 years later. I knew it would be. We hadn't done nearly enough work since the last time. As a nation, we have been here 1,000 times before, maybe more. Of course, if you're white like me, you may not have known it. But Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, women, disabled folks, queer folks, so many people on this stolen land have experienced this over and over again in the last 500 years of colonization. Perhaps, though, it had never been this combination of bad on the scale of fascism and white awareness of its presence, now in the most powerful position in the country again. Last month, as every year, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was celebrated across the country, maybe for the last time for the foreseeable future, who's to say? I didn't get to spend much time with him and his legacy much last month, and the state of DEI being what it is or is not, I want to do that today and to focus on the later king, the woke king, the king who called not only for justice, but for equity, for freedom, for the beloved kingdom to become real here and now by our labor, called by new visions and understandings. The king who had tired of white liberals, who had been betrayed by them. The king who asked in his final book, written in 1967, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? With all that he accomplished in his all-too-short life, including the most noted signing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, among many other things, it wasn't until after the Voting Rights Act, as white liberals began en masse to abandon civil rights causes and feel that they had accomplished what they considered to be enough, that King found himself finally truly confronted with the undeniable and unapologetic sin of this country, white supremacy, and that it would not be undone by anyone, least of all a Black man, without the same violence it had unleashed since Columbus had mistakenly found his way here. It's the post-Voting Rights Act king who experienced America as it really was, not always the mean Bull Connor's America, or even the white liberals disappearing from beside him America. It was when King went to California, experienced the Watts riots, that he began to understand that organizing, boycotting, marching, and civil disobedience would only get so far, no matter how often he had been linked arm in arm with white liberal clergy, politicians, and others, because white supremacy is so strong that it will return all gains with a deeper fury, like the storm John Lewis experienced as a child, and that fury would ensure that white people will act in its favor by siding with whiteness and its ideals, regardless of the ways a person's reality diverges from such an image. The way white people felt enough work had been done, the way poor white people identified themselves more strongly with middle class and rich white people than other poor folks of different ethnicities, the power of whiteness is so strong. It is this king who understood the true American dream, allegiance to the cause of white supremacy regardless of the cost. It is this king who, at the Ware Lecture of 1966, at our annual General Assembly, pleaded with us, Unitarian Universalists, his friends, allies, teachers, and mentors, that our faith not sleep through the revolution. If you're hoping for a happy ending here, I'm afraid to tell you that we, too, ignored his vision, even in the wake of his murder with the white empowerment issue of 1969 through 1970. We didn't understand the need to do our own work while working for justice in the world. We resisted the need to do our own work so hard and so actively that we have only begun to engage with it in the last decade. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution, King said in that lecture. Perhaps it was too obvious to be spoken, but it still needs to be named today somehow. That there is indeed one thing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution, that is to live through a revolution on the wrong side or just to the side. We UUs mostly manage to be in one or the other of those categories. We UUs as a whole have been so invested in our white supremacy culture and unexamined adjacency to it that we have caused harm to ourselves as a faith and to many individuals. Perhaps now, 56 years after his murder, we can heed his calls to us specifically. Shared with his friend Harry Belafonte not long before his death, King said, "I've come upon something that disturbs me deeply. We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have, and I know we will win. But I have come to believe that we are integrating into a burning house. I'm afraid that America has lost the moral vision she may have had, and I'm afraid that even as we integrate, we are walking into a place that does not understand that this nation needs to be deeply concerned with the plight of the poor and the disenfranchised. Until we commit ourselves to ensuring that the underclass is given justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears the soul of this nation. I fear I am integrating my people into a burning house." When asked what then do we do, King's response was that we become the firemen. It is the burning house that white America built and defends at all costs, except when we are actively fighting against it, when we are the people working to put out that fire and tear down the house. King was beginning to realize, first in traveling west and then north, that the problems that he had experienced in the South were superficial in comparison to those elsewhere, that the problems of America were far wider and deeper than he had understood, that they were even as wide and as deep as contemporaries Malcolm X and James Baldwin had been telling all who would listen. Toward the end of his life, King was realizing two things that impacted how he chose to do justice work. One, that the poor and disenfranchised needed to be part of the movement and that their basic needs had to be met. And two, that the signing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, white America believed its work to be done. As white Americans largely moved away from the justice work King called for, an extension of the coalition building and partnering he had done through his career, focus was lost and chaos ensued. As King was dreaming and strategizing about how to make community from that chaos. King was struggling, wrestling with how to move forward. He envisioned a Poor People's Campaign, which he and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began planning for in November of 1967. And for those curious, one of the speakers at this year's General Assembly is someone who has been working with the reincarnation of the Poor People's Campaign to live into King's dream. The Poor People's Campaign was a strategy that would serve both to rekindle coalition building and foster community building across a particular and different identity than he and the SCLC had previously engaged, attempting to unite by class. It is arguable that this transition is why King was murdered less than 5 months later. King was coming to understand deeply why Malcolm X and James Baldwin had called repeatedly for attention to be turned to the Black community. Malcolm X had called for separatism to allow Black folks to focus attention, energy, and resources on each other to build each other up. Baldwin, never really an activist, but always a witness, recorder, critic of white supremacy, and champion of Black people, to continue to encourage Black folks to find strength and support in one another. In his work, King learned about the power of fellowship, about absolute clarity of purpose, knowing who you are and who you serve, and about being mission-driven. These lessons were part of what made King and all who supported him, and there were many, so successful. And it is in these lessons from King, Baldwin, and Malcolm X that are so timely for this moment in history and in our lives as individuals and as a nation. I am a student of history, among other things. Over and over again, I have seen the scenarios play out both in the United States and elsewhere. It is the story of white America. We take, and we propose compromise and limitations that we can just have, and then we turn around and take some more. Our nation's history at times has looked a lot like the first Trump presidency did, and looking how it is so far in these 2 weeks. You do something audacious and horrible, people will protest, and there's a little bit of a pullback, maybe, and maybe an apology, maybe not, hard to say. And the next time, whatever happens is worse, constantly pushing us further and further toward fascism, giving over more and more. And here we are. At the end of his previous presidency, he instigated a coup on the Capitol, members of Congress in lockdown, heavily armed pseudo-militants storming and entering the building, sometimes with the aid of the officers charged with protecting it, a gallows built, noose hung, and standing outside, waiting for use. There were all sorts of calls for healing, for reconciliation, for moving on right after, but gallows are not meant for healing, or reconciliation, or moving on. Those who played a role in that day's events have even now been pardoned for their participation. Those who have aided and abetted the situation, the individual people, the party, the politicians, the corporate media, this is the culmination of more than a decade of increasing escalation to this point, with concession after concession, normalizing after normalizing of horrible behavior in the name of civility, balance, and fairness. We, as a country, have chosen chaos over community. We must act to build the world we dream about and not allow fear to make it for us. I have preached some of this material before, 4 years ago, after the insurrection and coup attempt at the Capitol. I spoke about the need for accountability for those who participated in these events and those who instigated them. What the last 4 years have taught me is that we are nowhere near a place where accountability can happen. When we elect people who practice fascist tactics, supported by media and millions of voters who are more invested in the perpetuation of white supremacy culture, and as Isabel Wilkerson argues so clearly in her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, the dominant, that is white caste, we cannot experience accountability. For accountability, we need our elected officials, especially our legislature right at this moment, as well as governors and others, to resist the many wrongs now being dropped on us multiple times a day. They have overwhelmingly, including in this election season, rolled over like tumbleweeds in the breeze, bowing before our current president as if he were some all-powerful wizard who could grant them more power. They must be held accountable by us, and they must start holding this administration accountable for its misdeeds, which it appears they are actually doing, but at the rate things are going, I keep losing track. What we must keep doing is caring for each other. You will probably get tired of hearing me preach that message, but it's the best one that we have. We must bring order to the chaos and do the work of building community as King did. We must remember that he was always part of a movement, building coalitions and working in partnership with others. We must do the same. Better, we must find the people who have been doing the work and support their efforts. Stacey Abrams showed us both how to do this and how effective it is when we do during the last election cycle, and as a reminder that white people need to start doing our own part. We must do our own healing of the terror of the previous time this administration was in office and these last 2 weeks of the current administration, as well as the last 500 plus years. Truthfully, deeply, in relationship, in humility. Learning to use our power and privilege where we have it as a shield, as protection, while lifting the more marginalized and oppressed up and following them. Why? Because they know what they're doing, because they've been doing it for generations. We must turn to each other, to the work of love being done in this world already. We will work together, and we will build each other up so high, we will build such strength in numbers and depth. We will feed and care for each other, watch each other sleep, fight for health care and access and education and living sustainable wages for all. Rights for what it means to live a decent human life. We will move money, resources, infrastructure, power to the people doing this work. We will use our power to lift each other up so that we might all rise. And we will not learn to tolerate each other, but to deeply love each other, to celebrate what it means to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to be queer, to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and other sexual and gender minorities, to be disabled, neurodivergent, to become trauma-informed, to tell the truth for the love of all that is good and holy, tell the truth no matter how it hurts to do so, to be an accountable, growing, loving relationship. We are bound together in this life. When we learn to embrace these bonds, we will make the beloved kingdom possible so that we can all be free. That was King's dream. Let's make it a reality, acting like our lives depend on it, because they do. If you would please rise and lift your voice in song. Thank you. Our closing hymn is Building Bridges.